November 1, 1943, Bougainville. The jungle breathed, not with wind, but with the weight of water suspended in air so thick it felt like drowning on dry land. In the pre-dawn darkness of Empress Augusta Bay, the only sounds were the rhythmic slap of boots in mud and the metallic clink of equipment that no amount of training could silence. Private First Class Tony Stein moved through the blackness with 43 pounds of gear strapped to his frame, including the 8.5-pound rifle that had become the subject of endless debate among men who had never fired it in anger. The M1 Garand. Too heavy, they said, too complicated, too much rifle for what a man could carry through places like this, where every ounce became an enemy by the third mile. But on this morning, as the first elements of the 3rd Marine Division prepared to storm ashore on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map, weight would prove to be the least of anyone's concerns. The invasion of Bougainville represented a calculated step in the island-hopping campaign that would define the Pacific War's final 2 years. After the brutal lessons of Guadalcanal and the grinding attrition of New Georgia, American strategic planning had evolved. Admiral William Halsey's South Pacific Command needed an airfield close enough to neutralize the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul without the catastrophic cost of taking Rabaul itself. Bougainville, the largest of the Solomon Islands, offered that possibility. Its eastern shore, near Cape Torokina, presented terrain ill-suited for large-scale defense but perfect for rapid airfield construction. Intelligence estimated 17,000 Japanese troops scattered across the island, with concentrated forces at the southern and northern ends. The landing zone itself appeared lightly defended. The phrase "appeared" would prove significant. What the intelligence photographs could not capture was the nature of the defense the Japanese had prepared. Since their withdrawal from Guadalcanal 9 months earlier, Imperial Japanese forces had refined their tactical doctrine for island defense. Gone were the bonsai charges that had produced dramatic casualties for minimal gain. In their place emerged a philosophy of defense in depth, utilizing the jungle itself as a weapon. Every ridge became a fortress, every ravine a killing ground. Machine gun positions were sited with interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged so thoroughly that men could walk within feet of them and see only vegetation. The Japanese had studied American tactics and identified a vulnerability: the reliance on volume of fire over precision, the assumption that superior firepower could substitute for superior position. They would test that assumption with positions prepared over months, stocked with ammunition, and supplied with men willing to die in place rather than retreat. For the Marines loading into Higgins boats in the pre-dawn darkness, these considerations remained abstract. What mattered was the immediate: the weight of the pack, the dampness of the rifle stock, the metallic taste of fear that no amount of training could eliminate. Tony Stein checked his rifle for the dozenth time, a ritual that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with control. The M1 Garand had entered service in 1936, the first semi-automatic rifle adopted as a standard infantry weapon by any military in the world. General George Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised, but in 1943 that judgment remained unwritten. What existed was controversy. Ordnance officers praised its firepower. 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition fired as fast as a man could pull the trigger, without the need to manually work a bolt between shots. Combat veterans were less certain. The rifle weighed nearly a pound more than the bolt-action Springfield it replaced. It was longer, making it awkward in tight quarters. The distinctive ping of the ejecting en-bloc clip supposedly told the enemy when you were empty, though no confirmed instance of this tactical disadvantage had ever been documented. Most significantly, it was complex. 8 moving parts in the gas operating system alone, each requiring maintenance, each a potential point of failure in an environment where red mud could jam a mechanism in seconds. Stein had made peace with the weapon through familiarity. A toolmaker before the war, he understood machinery, understood that complexity became reliability once you learned the system's logic. He had fired thousands of rounds in training, knew the rhythm of the reload, the feel of the bolt sliding home on a fresh clip. He had learned to field strip the rifle in darkness, to clear a malfunction by touch alone. These were not exceptional skills. Every Marine received the same training. But Stein possessed something that training could not provide, the craftsman's instinct that treats a tool as an extension of will rather than an external object. When he held the rifle, it ceased to be 8.5 pounds of wood and steel. It became possibility. The boats hit the beach at 7:30 in the morning. The invasion plan called for coordinated landings across multiple beaches, supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes that had been pounding suspected Japanese positions since first light. The bombardment had been thorough to the point of excess, thousands of shells transforming sections of jungle into moonscape. It had also been largely ineffective. The Japanese defensive positions, dug into reverse slopes and concealed in caves, had weathered the bombardment with minimal casualties. Now, as the first waves of Marines pushed inland from the beach, they moved into terrain that looked devastated but remained lethal. The first contact came not as the expected machine gun fire, but as single, carefully aimed shots. Japanese snipers, positioned in trees and spider holes, began picking off officers and radio men. These were not harassment fires, but precision elimination of command and control elements. Within the first hour, 3 company commanders were hit. Radio operators, identifiable by their equipment, died before they could establish communications with battalion. The American advance, planned as a rapid push to secure the beachhead perimeter, began to fragment into isolated unit actions, each platoon fighting its own war in vegetation so dense that men 20 yards apart could not see each other. Stein's platoon pushed northwest from the beach, tasked with securing a ridge that overlooked the landing zone. The terrain rose gradually, but each yard gained felt like climbing. The jungle floor was a tangle of roots and vines that caught boots and turned ankles. Visibility extended perhaps 10 yards on a clear sightline, often much less. The heat was extraordinary. Men who had trained in the California desert found this worse. The humidity made cooling impossible, turned every breath into work. Within 2 hours, cases of heat exhaustion began appearing. Within 3, men were dropping from heat stroke despite having drunk their canteens dry. The Japanese had prepared the ridge with characteristic thoroughness. The forward slope appeared undefended, inviting the Americans to climb into a prepared kill zone. The reverse slope held the real defenses, bunkers constructed of logs and earth, impervious to anything short of a direct hit from naval gunfire, positioned to deliver flanking fire across the crest. Light machine gun positions covered every approach, sighted so that attacking one position exposed you to fire from 2 others. The defensive complex had been constructed to maximize American casualties while requiring minimal Japanese manpower. 30 men, well positioned and supplied, could hold such a position against hundreds. The platoon reached the base of the ridge at 10:15. The platoon commander, a lieutenant barely 3 months out of officer candidate school, consulted his map and made the decision that doctrine required. They would assault up the slope in 2 squads, using fire and movement, supported by a light machine gun team that would provide suppressive fire from the base. It was the correct tactical choice given the information available. It was also exactly what the Japanese defenders expected. The lead squad made it halfway up the slope before the first machine gun opened fire. The sound in jungle combat is distinctive, not the sharp crack of rifle fire, but a stuttering roar, individual shots blending into continuous noise. Men who had never experienced it often froze for a critical second, unable to process the difference between cover and concealment, unable to understand that the vegetation that blocked their vision would not block bullets. 3 Marines went down in the first burst, 2 dead before they hit the ground, the 3rd screaming with both legs shattered. The advance stopped. Men pressed themselves into whatever depression the ground offered, returning fire at muzzle flashes they could barely see. The platoon commander attempted to maneuver the 2nd squad to flank the position, but movement revealed a 2nd machine gun, positioned precisely to cover that approach. More men went down. The light machine gun team at the base tried to suppress the Japanese positions but couldn't identify clear targets through the vegetation. They fired in the direction of sound, expending ammunition without effect. Within 15 minutes, the assault had stalled. Within 30, it had become a question of withdrawal versus annihilation. This was the moment that separated training from war. In training, when an exercise went badly, you stopped, received critique, and ran it again. In combat, there was no stopping, no reset. There was only the situation as it existed and the decision of what to do about it. Men who had seemed capable in training discovered capacities they didn't know they possessed. Others discovered limits. Leadership emerged from unexpected sources, not because of rank, but because of action. Stein had gone to ground with the rest of the squad when the firing started, but unlike many, he had not frozen. His toolmaker's training had taught him to diagnose problems through observation, to identify the functional elements of a system. He began cataloging what he could see and deduce. The primary machine gun was positioned somewhere on the right side of the crest, firing in traversing bursts that swept the slope. The muzzle flash gave a rough position, but the weapon itself remained invisible behind vegetation and earthworks. The second gun was further left, firing shorter bursts, suggesting it was covering a specific kill zone rather than sweeping freely. Between them lay perhaps 30 yards of crestline. Somewhere in that space was a gap, a position that neither gun could effectively cover without radically shifting position. Finding that gap required movement, and movement drew fire. He called to the Marine nearest him, a 19-year-old from Oklahoma who had been in the Corps 6 months. "When I move, you put rounds on that right side position, not automatic, 1 round every 2 seconds. Make them think about their heads." The Oklahoma Marine nodded, his face slick with sweat and fear, but his hands steady on his rifle. Stein moved. Not a run, but a controlled crawl, using every depression in the ground, every fallen log. The M1 Garand, cradled in his arms, proved its weight in a way he hadn't anticipated. The rifle was substantial enough that it didn't shift as he moved, didn't need constant adjustment. It stayed where he put it, ready. He covered 15 yards before the right-side machine gun swung toward him, bullets chewing through foliage 6 inches above his head. The Oklahoma Marine fired and fired again, and the machine gun's attention shifted. Stein used those seconds to cover another 10 yards, putting himself at an angle where the slope's contour provided genuine cover rather than concealment. From this position, he could see what he needed to see. The right-side machine gun position was a bunker, the firing port a narrow aperture cut in logs and packed earth. The weapon itself was a Type 92 heavy machine gun fed by metal strips. Sustained rate of fire 450 rounds per minute. The crew would be 3 men, gunner, loader, and ammunition handler. The position's construction meant they were protected from frontal fire and most flanking fire, but it also meant their field of view was limited to what they could see through the firing port. They could traverse the gun perhaps 30 degrees before the aperture's edge blocked further movement. Stein had positioned himself outside that arc. He rose to one knee, brought the Garand to his shoulder, and began the work of precision. The first shot was ranging, aimed at the visible corner of the firing port. The 30-06 round struck wood, and he saw splinters. The second shot adjusted, aimed 6 inches deeper. This one went through the aperture. He couldn't see the effect, but the machine gun's fire ceased. Abruptly, he fired again and again, placing rounds through the narrow opening with the mechanical precision of a man driving rivets. 8 rounds in less than 15 seconds. The end block clip ejected with its distinctive ping, and he had a fresh clip loaded before the sound faded. The second machine gun began firing at him, but from its angle it had to fire across the slope rather than down it, and the ground's contour made that difficult. Stein shifted position, moving another 5 yards to his left, changing the geometry. From here, he could see the second position's approximate location through a gap in the vegetation. He couldn't see the firing port, but he could see where the vegetation moved when the gun fired, the muzzle blast creating a pressure wave that disturbed leaves. He aimed at that disturbance and began firing again. 8 rounds, reload, 8 more. He wasn't trying for precision now, but suppression, forcing the crew to keep their heads down, disrupting their ability to target the pinned-down Marines on the slope. The platoon commander, observing from below, understood what Stein had created: a temporary advantage, a moment when the defense was disrupted. He ordered the squad to move, and they did, scrambling up the slope while Stein continued to fire. The advance covered 20 yards before the Japanese recovered and began responding. Rifle fire now, from positions along the crest that had remained silent until this moment. The defenders were revealing themselves to stop the assault, and in doing so, they provided targets. Stein saw a muzzle flash from a spider hole 15 yards to his right. He swung the Garand, acquired the position, fired 3 times. The muzzle flash stopped. Another flash, this one further left. He engaged, fired, reloaded. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost mechanical. Identify, acquire, fire, assess, reload. The rifle's semi-automatic action meant he never lost sight of the target while cycling the bolt. His focus remained constant, his field of view uninterrupted. This was the Garand's true advantage, not the weight of fire, but the continuity of engagement. A bolt-action rifleman had to break his sight picture 5 times to fire 5 shots, dropping behind cover or looking away from the scope to manipulate the bolt. The Garand allowed continuous target tracking, continuous pressure. The defender could never be certain the rifleman was reloading, could never be certain of a safe moment to move or return fire. The tactical situation evolved rapidly. The squad reached the crest and began clearing positions with grenades and close-range fire. The Japanese defenders, following their doctrine, did not retreat. They fought from their positions until killed or until the position became untenable, at which point they withdrew to the next prepared position and fought again. This was defense in depth, not as a theoretical concept, but as lived reality. Each position cost time and lives to clear. Each clearing operation provided the defenders behind it with information about American tactics and positioning. Stein reached the crest at 11:40. The fighting had been continuous for over an hour. His rifle's barrel was hot enough that he could feel the heat radiating through the wood stock. He had fired perhaps 60 rounds, more than half his basic load. Around him, Marines were consolidating the position, preparing for the counterattack that experience said would come. The wounded were being gathered and treated with whatever medical supplies remained. The dead were being laid out in a line behind the crest, covered with ponchos. There were 8 of them. 8 men who had woken that morning in the Higgins boats, who had stormed the beach, who had climbed the ridge. Now they were numbers, casualties in an operation that strategic planners in Noumea would assess as moderate resistance. The platoon commander found Stein behind a fallen log, reloading magazines from the bandolier of .30-06 rounds he carried. "That was good work on the bunker," the lieutenant said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had just discovered that command in combat bore no resemblance to command in training. "How many rounds you got left?" Stein did a quick count. 40, maybe 45. I was carrying extra clips. "We're getting resupply up here once they clear the beach trail. Hour, maybe 2. The lieutenant looked out over the slope they had just climbed, at the jungle that had seemed so empty and now revealed itself as layered with death. "Regiment thinks the Jabs will counterattack tonight. They always do. Try to push us off the high ground before we can dig in." This assessment was based on experience from Guadalcanal in New Georgia, where Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized immediate counterattack to recapture lost positions. The doctrine was rooted in both tactical logic and cultural imperative. Tactically, an immediate counterattack caught the attackers while they were disorganized before they could prepare defenses. Culturally, the idea of yielding ground without attempting to recapture it was anathema to the offensive spirit that Japanese military training emphasized. The counterattacks were often conducted at night, using the darkness to negate American advantages in firepower and air support. They were typically frontal, accepting casualties to achieve breakthrough. Against dug-in positions, they were usually unsuccessful. But they were predictable, and predictability in warfare is a vulnerability that doctrine cannot easily address. The afternoon passed in the peculiar combination of tedium and tension that characterized defensive preparation. The Marines dug foxholes in the coral-laced soil, using entrenching tools that bent and broke against the harder substrate. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the approaches. They laid trip flares and improvised early warning devices, tin cans filled with pebbles suspended from wire. They ate cold rations and drank water that tasted of the purification tablets. They cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, and tried to rest in a place where rest was impossible. Stein used the time to perform maintenance on the Garand. He field-stripped the rifle, cleaning the gas cylinder and operating rod with solvent and a patch cut from his undershirt. The mechanism was dirty but functional, no evidence of the malfunction that critics claimed was inevitable. He checked the trigger assembly, the hammer spring, the ejector. Everything moved as it should. He reassembled the rifle, performed a function check, and reloaded. The ritual was soothing. The familiar sequence of actions a reminder that some things remained within his control. At 1700 hours, the expected resupply arrived. Ammunition, water, and rations hauled up the ridge by Marines from the Beach Support Battalion. With it came the day's first reliable casualty figures. The landing had put 14,000 Marines ashore. Current estimates put American casualties at 78 dead, 204 wounded. Japanese casualties were unknown but assessed as significant. The beachhead was secure, but the interior remained contested. Patrols sent inland had encountered resistance ranging from sniper fire to prepared defensive lines. The island was not lightly defended. It was defended with precision. Night fell with tropical abruptness, the sun dropping behind the western horizon and darkness arriving within 30 minutes. The jungle sounds changed. The bird calls that had formed a background chorus during daylight ceased, replaced by insect noise so loud it made quiet conversation difficult. The Marines on the ridge settled into their fighting positions, 2 men per foxhole, one awake while the other rested. Sleep was theoretical. The adrenaline that had sustained men through the day's fighting now worked against rest, keeping minds active, replaying the day's events, anticipating what the night would bring. The counterattack began at 22:15. It was preceded by 15 minutes of mortar fire, shells falling randomly across the ridgetop, aimed less at specific targets than at disruption and demoralization. The explosions lit the darkness in brief, stroboscopic flashes that destroyed night vision and made observation impossible. Then the mortar stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. They came from the north side of the ridge, moving through terrain they knew from months of occupation. Intelligence would later estimate the attacking force at company strength, approximately 200 men from the IJA 23rd Infantry Regiment. They advanced in small groups, using the vegetation for concealment, maintaining fire discipline until they were close enough that automatic weapons would be effective. The first indication of the assault was the sound of movement, branches breaking, equipment rattling. Then came the battle cry that American Marines had learned to recognize and dread, banzai. Not the wild charge of early war propaganda, but a signal, a coordination point that announced the final rush. The American line erupted in defensive fire. Rifle muzzle flashes created a continuous string of light along the defensive perimeter. Machine guns opened up, tracers arcing into the darkness in streams that seemed solid. Grenades exploded in the dead space beyond the perimeter. The noise was so intense it ceased to be individual sounds and became a single roar, unending, overwhelming. Men fired at shadows, at movement, at nothing. The need to act overwhelming the need to acquire clear targets. Stein, positioned in a foxhole on the northern edge of the perimeter, held his fire. Years of working with precision tools had trained him to resist the urge to act without purpose. He waited, watching the darkness, looking for patterns in the chaos. There, movement against the slightly lighter sky, a silhouette rising from the vegetation 30 yards out. He acquired the target, squeezed the trigger, saw the silhouette fall. Another figure, closer now, running across a gap in the undergrowth. He fired twice, both rounds center mass. The figure went down. To his left, a Marine was firing on full automatic, burning through his ammunition load in long bursts that lit up his position and made him a target. "Single shots," Stein yelled, "make them count." Whether the Marine heard him over the noise was uncertain, but the message got through. The rate of fire slowed, became more deliberate. The assault lasted 40 minutes. In that time, the Japanese forces made 3 separate attempts to breach the Marine perimeter, each time getting within grenade range before being driven back by concentrated fire. The attacks were brave to the point of suicidal, men advancing into fire they knew would kill them, driven by duty or desperation or the simple momentum of the assault. They died in piles at the perimeter's edge, bodies creating obstacles that subsequent waves had to climb over. The Marines fighting from prepared positions, with superiority in automatic weapons, held the line with losses that were minimal compared to the attackers. By midnight, the counterattack had broken, the surviving Japanese forces withdrawing into the jungle to regroup, or, more likely, to die quietly of wounds in the darkness. Stein had fired 41 rounds during the engagement, nearly exhausting his ammunition. Around him, other Marines were calling out for more clips, more ammunition, the resupply from earlier in the day consumed by the defensive battle. The platoon sergeant moved along the line, redistributing ammunition from those who had fired less to those who had fired more. A battlefield economy that left some positions dangerously low but kept the line functional. Dawn came as a gradual graying, the darkness becoming merely dim. With enough light to see, the Marines began assessing the night's work. The ground in front of the perimeter was littered with Japanese dead. 53 bodies counted in the immediate vicinity, likely more further out where the jungle obscured the view. The Marine casualties were lighter. 4 dead, 11 wounded, 3 of those seriously enough to require evacuation. The mathematics of defensive warfare, played out in blood and survival. The second day followed a pattern similar to the first, probing attacks, sniper fire, small unit actions as the Marines expanded the perimeter and the Japanese forces contested every yard. Stein's platoon remained on the ridge, now serving as a strong point in the expanding defensive network. The work was less dramatic than the previous day's assault, but no less deadly. A sniper would fire from concealment, kill or wound a Marine, and disappear before return fire could be effective. Patrols sent to clear suspected positions would trigger ambushes. The jungle itself became the enemy, limiting visibility, channeling movement, turning every trail into a potential kill zone. Over the course of that day, Stein engaged 14 separate targets, each time a single figure or position identified through careful observation. He was not the platoon's heaviest shooter, the machine gun teams fired thousands of rounds, but he became its most consistent, the rifleman that the platoon commander began directing towards specific problems. A sniper harassing the left flank from an unknown position. Stein spent an hour observing, identified the muzzle flash, put 3 rounds into the tree where the sniper had positioned himself. A mortar observer calling in fire from a concealed position somewhere on the reverse slope. Stein spotted the antenna wire that gave away the position, engaged with precision fire that silenced the observer. His reputation, unspoken but understood, began to shift from competent rifleman to specialist, the man you called when accuracy mattered more than volume. By the third day, November 3rd, the pattern had intensified. The Japanese, recognizing that the beachhead was solidifying, committed forces to disrupting the American consolidation. The attacks were no longer massed counterassaults, but infiltration tactics, small groups penetrating the perimeter at night or during periods of reduced visibility, targeting command posts and supply areas. The defensive line became porous, with contact occurring at unexpected points in unexpected ways. Marines learned to be suspicious of everything, to treat the jungle itself as hostile. On that third day, Stein's documented kills reached 17. Not 17 engagements, 17 confirmed dead, bodies recovered or observed attributable to his rifle. The accounting was not his doing. The platoon commander, required to file daily reports on ammunition expenditure and tactical results, had been tracking Stein's effectiveness as part of understanding the platoon's combat performance. 17 confirmed kills over 9 hours of active combat, achieved with approximately 130 rounds fired. The ratio was extraordinary, far exceeding the average hit probability for rifle fire in combat conditions. More significantly, the kills were tactical rather than merely statistical. Each represented the elimination of a specific threat: a machine gun position, a sniper, a mortar observer, an infiltrator. The significance of this was not immediately apparent to Stein. He understood that he had been effective, that his fire had achieved its purpose, but the idea that this effectiveness was exceptional hadn't occurred to him. He was doing what he had been trained to do, using the weapon he had been issued, engaging targets as they presented themselves. That this constituted anything noteworthy seemed irrelevant to the immediate reality of surviving the next engagement. But within the platoon, and increasingly within the company, the story was taking shape. Marines talked, shared observations, built narratives from the chaos of combat. The story that emerged was about the rifle as much as the rifleman. The M1 Garand, the weapon that was too heavy, too complicated, too much, had proven itself in the hands of a man who understood it. While other Marines struggled with malfunctions and complained about weight, Stein had fired hundreds of rounds without failure, had carried the rifle through terrain that exhausted men carrying lighter loads, had achieved precision that justified every ounce of its design. The rifle became a character in the story, not just equipment, but the tool that transformed capability into result. This narrative served a psychological purpose beyond mere storytelling. The Marines on Bougainville, like those on Guadalcanal before them and Tarawa after, existed in an environment of controlled chaos. Death was random, skill often indistinguishable from luck. Men who did everything right died from artillery shells they never saw coming. Men who made mistakes survived by chance. In this environment, the need for some sense of control, some belief that skill and preparation mattered, was overwhelming. The story of Stein and his Garand provided that belief. It suggested that the right tool, properly mastered, could create an edge. It transformed the rifle from an object of complaint into an object of faith. The broader historical context of this small story, on one ridge on one island, was significant. The M1 Garand's adoption had been controversial since its inception. Ordnance experts praised it. Combat formations distrusted it. The debate was not merely technical but philosophical, a question of what modern infantry combat required. The traditional view, rooted in 19th-century doctrine, held that aimed fire from bolt-action rifles, delivered by well-trained marksmen, was the foundation of infantry effectiveness. The newer view, emerging from analysis of World War I, argued that volume of fire and suppression mattered more than individual accuracy, that the purpose of rifle fire was to enable movement rather than to achieve kills. The M1 Garand represented an attempt to reconcile these views, a rifle that preserved accuracy while enabling rapid fire, that allowed the individual rifleman to deliver sustained fire without sacrificing precision. But doctrine and reality often diverged. The conditions of jungle combat, limited visibility, close-range engagements, the difficulty of acquiring clear targets seemed to favor automatic weapons and volume of fire over precision. The Japanese, equipped with bolt-action Arisaka rifles but employing them in prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, had proven effective against American forces despite being outgunned. The question was whether the Garand's advantages mattered in this environment, whether semi-automatic fire was meaningful when targets appeared for seconds at ranges measured in yards. Bougainville provided an answer, not through formal study but through accumulated experience. Marines began recognizing that the Garand allowed sustained engagement in ways that bolt-action rifles did not. In defensive fighting, when Japanese infiltrators appeared at the perimeter, the ability to fire multiple aimed shots without breaking the sight picture proved decisive. In offensive fighting, when clearing bunkers or advancing under fire, the ability to suppress a position while moving reduced casualties. The rifle was not perfect. It was still heavy, still complex, still required maintenance that bolt-action rifles did not. But it was effective, and effectiveness in combat was the only metric that ultimately mattered. Stein's use of the weapon demonstrated another principle, that the gap between a tool's potential and its realized effectiveness was often filled by the user's skill and understanding. The Garand in Stein's hands performed differently than in the hands of a Marine who viewed it as equipment rather than instrument. This was not a matter of natural talent, but of approach. Stein treated the rifle as a precision instrument because his pre-war experience had taught him to treat all tools that way. He understood that consistency came from systematic maintenance, that reliability came from understanding the mechanism's logic, that precision came from disciplined technique. These were learnable skills, not inherent gifts, and their application transformed the rifle's performance. By November 4th, the tactical situation on Bougainville had stabilized into what would become the pattern for the next 6 months. The Americans held a defensible perimeter around the beachhead and were constructing the airfields that were the operation's strategic purpose. The Japanese held the interior and would continue to mount attacks aimed at disrupting construction and pushing the Americans back into the sea. Neither side had the strength to decisively defeat the other. The campaign would become one of attrition, measured in daily casualties and yards of terrain, a grinding match that lacked the dramatic narrative of breakthrough or collapse. Stein's platoon was rotated off the ridge on the 5th day, replaced by fresh troops from the division reserve. They moved back to the beach perimeter, where conditions were marginally better, actual foxholes instead of hasty scrapes, hot food instead of cold rations, the possibility of rest. Stein slept for 14 hours, woke to clean his rifle, and slept another 6. The exhaustion was comprehensive, physical and mental, the accumulated cost of 5 days of continuous alertness. When he finally returned to full consciousness, he found that the story of the ridge had preceded him. The battalion commander wanted to see him. The meeting was brief, informal, the colonel asking questions about the rifle's performance, about Stein's maintenance procedures, about how he had achieved the effectiveness documented in the after-action reports. Stein answered honestly, without embellishment. He had done what he was trained to do. The rifle had worked as designed. He had been lucky. The colonel disagreed about the luck. Luck is random, son. What you did was consistent. That's not luck. That's skill. He paused, studying the young Marine. We're going to be recommending you for promotion. The Corps needs NCOs who understand their equipment and can teach others. You've proven you understand the Garand better than most. The promotion would come 3 weeks later. The teaching would begin immediately. Stein spending his time between combat operations, instructing newer Marines on rifle maintenance and marksmanship principles. He was not a natural instructor, his explanations sometimes too technical, assuming knowledge that others lacked. But he was patient, and he genuinely wanted the men around him to survive, and those qualities made him effective despite his pedagogical limitations. The M1 Garand would go on to arm American forces through the remainder of World War II and into Korea. Its reputation, initially mixed, solidified into near-universal praise as more Marines and soldiers experienced its advantages in combat. The criticisms that had seemed significant in peacetime, the weight, the complexity, the distinctive clip ejection, proved trivial compared to its effectiveness in battle. By 1945, the question was not whether the Garand was superior to bolt-action rifles, but how quickly semi-automatic designs could be extended to other infantry weapons. The rifle's impact extended beyond immediate tactical effectiveness. It represented a shift in military thinking, an acceptance that technological advantage could be decisive if matched with proper training and doctrine. The American military's willingness to equip its entire infantry force with a complex, expensive weapon reflected a commitment to material superiority that would define its approach to warfare for the next 70 years. The Garand was not just a rifle, but a statement, that individual soldiers were valuable enough to deserve the best possible tools, that winning battles justified the investment in superior equipment. For Tony Stein, the experience on Bougainville was formative but not defining. He would continue to fight through the Pacific Campaign, would eventually transfer to the newly formed paratrooper units, would storm the beaches at Iwo Jima, carrying not a Garand, but a modified aircraft machine gun he called his Stinger. He would earn the Medal of Honor on that black sand beach, the citation describing repeated trips into enemy fire to retrieve ammunition for his squad. He would die on Iwo Jima, killed by enemy fire while leading his men in an assault on a fortified position. He was 24 years old. But on that ridge on Bougainville, during 9 hours of continuous combat, he demonstrated what was possible when skill met opportunity, when proper equipment met proper understanding. 17 confirmed kills was a number, a statistic that would appear in after-action reports and battalion records. But the meaning of that number extended beyond body count. It represented the vindication of a design philosophy, the proof that semi-automatic fire in the hands of a trained rifleman was not just different from bolt-action precision, but better. It represented the American approach to warfare, accepting complexity to achieve superiority, investing in equipment to preserve lives, trusting that proper training would transform technological advantage into tactical dominance. The symbolic weight of the Garand extended beyond its physical presence. In a war fought across thousands of miles of ocean, on islands most Americans couldn't locate, against an enemy that seemed to prefer death to surrender, the rifle came to represent something larger than itself. It was American industrial capacity made tangible, 8.5 pounds of precision machinery produced by the millions, distributed to every rifleman, maintained by a logistics system that could supply parts and ammunition to the remotest islands. It was American belief in the individual, the idea that every soldier deserved the best possible equipment rather than just adequate gear. It was American pragmatism, the willingness to replace doctrine with better doctrine, to abandon tradition when tradition proved inferior. When Marines on later islands heard the distinctive ping of an ejecting clip, they no longer thought of it as a tactical liability. They thought of it as the sound of American firepower, the sound that meant someone on their side was in the fight, engaging, advancing, winning. The rifle that had been too heavy became the rifle they wanted to carry. The rifle that had been too complicated became the rifle they trusted. The rifle that had been questioned became the rifle that defined a generation of infantry combat. The jungle on Bougainville eventually reclaimed the ridge where Stein fought. The fighting positions eroded, filled with earth, disappeared under vegetation. The battlefield artifacts, spent brass, rusted weapons, the debris of war, corroded and vanished. But the lessons remained, encoded in doctrine, passed through training, remembered in the institutional memory of the Corps. The lesson that proper equipment, properly used, saved lives. The lesson that semi-automatic fire was not a luxury but a necessity. The lesson that investing in soldiers paid dividends measured in victory. In the end, the story of Tony Stein and his Garand on that November ridge was not about individual heroism, though courage was present. It was not about technological determinism, though equipment mattered. It was about the intersection of preparation and moment, about what becomes possible when training meets crisis, when doctrine meets reality, when the tool in hand proves equal to the task at hand. It was about the transformation of complaint into confidence, of skepticism into trust, of weight into worthiness. The men who fought on Bougainville would fight on other islands. The rifle they carried would arm other men in other wars. But the proof established on that ridge, that the M1 Garand was not too heavy, not too complicated, not too much, but rather exactly what was needed, endured. It endured in the confidence of the men who carried it, in the doctrine that employed it, in the victories it enabled. The rifle that was questioned in peace proved itself in war, not through proclamation but through performance, not through theory but through result. And on a ridge in the Solomon Islands, in a jungle so thick that visibility measured in yards, during 9 hours when every second held the possibility of death, One Marine with one rifle demonstrated what that performance meant. 17 enemies engaged, 17 enemies eliminated, 130 rounds fired, 0 malfunctions. 8.5 pounds of steel and wood and American engineering, carried through terrain that exhausted stronger men, fired until the barrel glowed, maintained with care that matched its precision, trusted with a faith that proved justified. They had called it too heavy. They had been wrong. Not because the weight wasn't real, it was, but because they had measured the cost without understanding the value, had focused on what the rifle demanded without recognizing what it delivered. In the calculus of combat, where lives were the currency and survival the profit, the M1 Garand proved its worth not through being light, but through being right. And on that November ridge, when the jungle breathed with death and every shadow held threat, rightness was worth every ounce.